This event is part of the free Champion Creativity professional learning community on edweb.net. And as a member of this community, you can access all past webinars and take the CE quizzes to earn a certificate for each you view. The recording slides and chat log from today's presentation will be posted in the webinar archives folder of the community within 24 hours. And then to get your certificate, if you're attending today's live session, you'll receive an email with a link to your certificate to the email address that you registered the session with. You'll receive that email on the first business day after this webinar. And if you are viewing this as a recording or if you join by phone, you'll need to join the free Champion Creativity community and take a quiz to earn your certificate. And we're going to start with this slide. We always start with student artwork. Is such an authentic, wonderful way to start. This student's art is perfect for our discussion today because it's vibrant and it's so full of energy. And the elements in this art look very interconnected, just like game making and how we like to use student-led game making and learning to connect many subjects together. And in fact, this art looks like a game board, and the student artist has named it Playtime.
So very excited about the topic that we have today and the illustrative examples that Jordan has to share with us, really co-created with his two sons, ages 9 and 11. And it's a very special insights that we get about the value of game making as a learning experience. So before we dive into the content, I just want to remind those of you who've attended Crayola webinars before that we really love inspiring you to create. And one of the ways that we reinforce that and encourage the sharing is after the webinar, if you would create your own student-led game with students, with children, and post it in the community, you will get a free product from Crayola. And here is a picture of what you'll get, a case, class pack of Crayola Model Magic. And for the first educators who post their photos of the student-made learning games will receive that. So we'd love to see your artwork from wherever you are around the world, and I know we get a lot of international participants, but due to shipping requirements, we can only send this to participants from the US and Canada. But we love to see the artwork and to see the games that you make with your students. So I'm just going to go over the key points, our objectives, our agenda for the next hour. We're going to start by talking about why student-made games are effective learning tools, and Jordan has some great insights on the benefits for students from using this as a teaching strategy. Then he's going to be outlining for us understanding games as systems and a lot about what makes games work. And when we as the educators are framing games in that way, students can use it as a springboard and take off and connect it to all sorts of learning content. Then Jordan will outline for us the different types of games that students often create that are really, popular with kids and why. And then Kristen's going to come on at the end and share with us some of the cross-curricular games that she's created that are standards-based, and she'll show you some examples of a range of games that she's made with her students. So now I'm going to turn it over to our guest faculty, Jordan Shapiro.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I'm excited for this. And I want to start by talking about why games and I'm gonna cover this in a few different ways. You can see my kids have designed these fantastic slides for me, and so sometimes it's not all clear what fits on each line, but I'll do my best to explain that to you. I'm going to say the first why games in a general sense, why games work for learning. Then we're going to go through and talk about how to have students design their own games. But first, let me just talk about why all games are great learning, right? When we play any game, whether you're playing tic-tac-toe or shoots and ladders or any game that you play, you're learning something. You're learning how the system of the game works. You're learning the rules of the game. But one of the reasons great games work so great in the classroom, beyond that, we'll get into those details in a moment, but a few of the reasons that these games work so well are we're going to start with. And those reasons we're going to cover are the idea of student motivation, the idea of an iterative mindset, and the idea of systems thinking. So let me start with this question of let me start with this question of motivation. And I want to really first talk about this big concept about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And if you're a regular who reads regular at reading education literature, you're probably pretty familiar with this idea. It comes from Carol Dweck originally. And the idea is that the kids can either be motivated, well, adults and kids can be motivated either by intrinsic motivations or extrinsic motivations. Put simply, the extrinsic motivations are those reward systems, those gold stars, those treats, or for adults, cash, right? But the intrinsic is when that learning comes from within, like it sounds like. You're motivated. I don't mean from within the individual, but you're motivated because that motivation is built into the system. Okay, and that's what works so great about games, is that when you're playing a game that works, when kids are learning with a game, they're learning in an intrinsically motivated way. Their goal is to understand the thing that they're playing. Their goal is not to receive a reward. Their goal is to be able to navigate the ideas, to navigate the system, to navigate these complex things, because they appreciate the learning. So games are great at this. If you just think for a second, you want to learn the rules of tic-tac-toe so that you can play the game, because when you play the game, you have more fun. Let's talk about this question of iteration. And one of the great things about games is this iterative mindset, this idea that when you play a game, you understand that failure is iteration. That failure doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean you're not good at a subject. It means that it's a step on the way to learning. Now, why does that work so well in the game world? Because when you play a game, when you play any game, you make lots of mistakes. I used to say to my kids all the time, the funny thing about games is that the winner is usually just the one who's lost the most, right? You lose 100 million times, and then you're an expert, right? And so now you can beat anybody, right? And we know this. We know that the more you practice something, the better you get at it. But that's sort of code, because practice sort of means I did it the wrong way so many times that I finally know how to do it the right way with ease, right? So what's great about games is that kids automatically, when playing a game, understand that it's not like taking a test where you fail, that says something about who you are. Instead, the failure is just an iterative step on the way to more success in the game world. The last point I want to make here about why games is that games make complex systems impossibly simple, right? And all you have to do is think about this. I don't know, I'm guessing most of you know about the video game Minecraft. This really struck me when I watched my kids play a video game like Minecraft, because I don't understand it. I look at them and I can't figure out what they're doing, and they move with such ease and with such understanding. They've been doing it since they were very, 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 very young. Well, all of those games involve tons of complex rules and systems and understanding how different pieces move and how different combinations function within the world of the game. That's a complex system, and they learn it very quickly, and they learn it very fast. And tic-tac-toe in some ways, well, that's a simple system, but a game like Monopoly, you just think about, that's a very complex system of trade and exchange. There's hotels, there's properties, you have to understand all of these rules. Kids learn that in about 5 minutes, right? And it's very easy to get them to understand that system. In fact, anyone who's ever tried to play a game with a kid knows the best way is you just start playing. You don't try to tell them the rules first. In some ways, we do it wrong, I've always thought, when we teach. It's like, we're going to make sure we test you on the game manual before we let you play the game. Right? Imagine if I did that. If I said, well, first let me give you the book, the top of the box for Monopoly, let you read all the rules, and give you a test, and then maybe after that you can possibly play. When we're talking about games from learning, we're saying let's immediately immerse someone in the system and let them learn, because they're intrinsically motivated to want to navigate through that system. Yes, they're going to make tons of mistakes. When you play Monopoly with kids, they make tons of mistakes. And they learn until they become masters of that system.
So I'll just review the kinds of benefits, because Jordan just beautifully articulated what students really gain from creating games and playing games. And it seems as if that most important one that you were emphasizing, Jordan, is this source of motivation, that when kids create their own games, it gives them a sense of agency and ownership So they're not only owning the play and proud of the way they set it up, but own all that learning that comes from it. Very empowering. And the other part that you mentioned that's so important is this metacognitive process, right? Where students think about their thinking. And because game creation and gameplay is so iterative, it leans in so beautifully to Carol Dweck's growth mindset that, you know, we can fall down and we pick ourselves up, and it's iteratively getting better every time. So important in terms of that perseverance and having kids think about their thinking. The other part that was really clear, and we're going to see more of this as you show us the games your kids made, is how it builds those strategic planning skills. You can't build a system and think about all the parts of a system interacting without really approaching it strategically, and, you know, sort of a cause and effect build. So strategic planning isn't something that just executives do and administrators do. It's something children do in this game planning. And then, of course, building that understanding of content in context. And that's a huge benefit that Kristen will be getting to later on as we close the webinar, when she shows us examples of students weaving content in context into their games. So thank you for the benefits. And we'll move on now to talking about what we mean of games as a system. So take it away, George.
Yeah, and just before I jump into games as systems, you know, your slide had that term metacognitive, which I didn't cover. So I want to just briefly just say a little bit about that metacognitive process and how that iterative mindset does it. And to do that, I think I just have to give people a very simple image that when you're playing a board game, when you're playing any kind of game, when you're playing a video game, there's always two eyes playing that system. There's the eye who's rolling the dice, and there's the eye that's that piece or that avatar moving around the board. And so automatically we get that metacognitive distance built into a game, right? And you did a great job of pointing out that iterative mindset's connected to that, because we're able to think about how we played the game rather than what kind of person am I, right? So you can be bad. Students may not be successful at winning a math game, but they don't internalize that as I'm bad at math. And that's very different, because often when we quiz kids on math, they internalize this as that's a judgment of who I am as a mathematician, where gaming doesn't do that in the same way. So I already said a bit about this understanding games as systems, but I'm going to do that in a little more detail now. And I'm going to start by talking about how you should think about the mechanics of a game and the way that becomes linked to the learning objectives that you're after. Now, if you've ever used games, and all teachers use games all the time, but they often, I know when I was a student, the games that they often used were we would play Jeopardy to review things, right? Where the teacher would put all the numbers on the board, 100, 500 categories, and we'd play a classroom-wide quiz show. That's a fantastic way to engage students. That's a fantastic way to learn these things, but and to practice with that already understood knowledge. But the mechanic of that game is basically a quiz, which is why we call it a quiz show, right? And so what we are actually teaching through that game is the ability to retain and recall information, to retain and recall facts, memorization, retention, recall. That's the mechanic of the game. That's how I play it. That's how I win. I need to retain, I need to be able to recall, and I need to be able to put that out for the judge, the teacher, to say whether it's correct or not. When I'm talking about games for learning, I'm talking about games where the mechanics are linked with the learning objectives. So an example of this might be a game as simple as Chutes and Ladders. If we think about what's in those mechanics that someone's learning as they play, well, a game like Chutes and Ladders actually has a very simple mechanical structure. The goal of that game is to count to 100, right? So it's actually a fantastic arithmetic game, right? As you roll your die, you get a 1, you move 1 square. You get a 3, you move 3 squares. Now you're up to 4. And the underlying mechanics of that game is basically counting, getting to this point where you're counting to 100 and getting closer and closer. When I'm talking about mechanics and learning objectives, I'm talking about really trying to link them up in a way where what you're learning is the system of the game. What else do we need to know about games? The first thing to be able to create a game where mechanics and learning objectives are tied together is to think about this concept of the magic circle. We talk about the magic circle in games all the time. The magic circle is this idea of boundaries, that a game exists inside a closed boundary system where the rules are separate from the outside world. Now, a great example of this is just you think about playing soccer or tennis. There's a court with actual lines drawn on the ground, and within those court, there's certain rules for how you behave outside the court. We are in the regular world. Inside the court, the context becomes the context of the game system, and that's what we're always trying to create when we build a game for learning. Is a place where the context becomes really, really linked to the content that we're trying to teach within a set of boundaries. The boundaries creates that kind of thing, and what it creates is this sense of rules and limitations, and it's the rules and limitations that express the learning of the game. Do you understand that for a second, right? We often think of rules and limitations as something that makes things not fun, right? But rules and limitations are what construct the boundaries of the game system. So if you think if you think about a game like checkers, right? It's the rules and the system in which you can move your red pieces or your black pieces to squares and hop another that actually create the game. They create the fun, and they create all the logic of the system that people are trying to master. And all those things together become the game mechanics, the mechanics of the game. So what we're trying to do is imagine games in a way that the mechanics link up with the learning objectives that we're after. So if we're making an accounting game, we want to make a game where the goal, the way that you win, the way that you succeed, the way that you have fun is by counting. If we're trying to make a game that's about history, we want to make it a game where understanding the history is the goal to success, right? And seeing the way that system works. So if we wanted to do a game, say, about chemistry, right? It would be about can you actually build a molecule? If you can design it, if you can link those things together, you want to create a game where that's the goal of the goal of the game is to understand exactly those things. This idea that effective gameplay has these multiple parts. It's got mechanics, and those mechanics need to be linked to the ultimate objective of the game. There has to be something that the player is trying to achieve. There needs to be rules and limitations, and those rules and limitations have to have consequences. Any teacher already knows that this is true, that learning only happens when you get immediate feedback. What's amazing is that games give immediate feedback in the form often of consequences that fit within the context of the game. I talked a bit about setting and boundaries and this idea that there's always going to be a magic circle, and that magic circle is going to include settings and boundaries. And I didn't talk about characters or tokens and currency, so let me talk about them right now. The characters I talked about actually at the beginning of this idea that the avatar, your game piece, represents yourself, and you have this metacognitive relationship to it. You're moving yourself through the game with an avatar. Tokens and currency is a very interesting thing that shows up in a lot of games. Not all games, but most games have some version of tokens and currency. Monopoly is a great example, obviously, because it looks just like our regular currency. But even in a game like Go Fish, you're trading the currency of patterns. You're trading the currency of different cards. I want more hearts than you. I want more spades than you. I want certain cards. And so that becomes some kind of currency that we're trading or collecting. It doesn't always have to be, it's not always about economics in order for tokens and currency to be a part of it. Sherry, is your sound working yet?
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Right. So in addition to those mechanics, it's great that you're going to take people through the different kinds of playing systems. And we're just going to outline a few here that you'll dive into more deeply. We're going to be talking about sorting and sequences and pattern recognition and helping people think about games they're familiar with, and that how students can use sim systems like that to design their own games. And then games that are built on chance. And then this whole concept, and you just referred to tokens and currency, but how those play into an accumulation or a trading or an exchange kind of game. And then you'll take people through puzzles, movement games, strategy games. So describe those different kinds of systems.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk a bit about this idea of mechanics and systems, which I've given a kind of high level overview of at this point, but I want to dig a little deeper into that. And to do that, I'll use that example I sort of finished with on the last slide. This example of just regular playing cards. Let's think about what we're actually doing in regular playing cards and what's the mechanics and the systems that underlies it, right? We have all these complex games like blackjack and rummy and gin and go fish and tons of games. Hopefully the kids aren't playing blackjack, but it's a game that exists. What that is essentially is a sorting game, right? We sort of get confused with the idea. We forget that there's 4 different suits and there's a whole bunch of numbers, and we're always trying to sort those. And so all of those games teach kids how to recognize the patterns and sort those patterns into a meaningful order. And so that becomes that system of that game. When you can get and that of course is the next slide. I jumped ahead of it, but when you can get kids to understand that sorting games involve that kind of pattern recognition, then you can start to ask them to sort for themselves, to create sorting games for lots of other situations, right? And so much of what we do in education is actually about sorting and pattern recognition. We sometimes don't realize that essentially we're often doing that. A great bit of biology, for example, is just about really understanding what category things fit in and being able to put them together in a very meaningful order that's become enormously useful for us as humanity. So sorting games are huge in this sense. But to make them work, you have to have all of these things that we've talked about. The goal here is to get kids to think about the subjects that they're doing in the subjects they're learning in this game-like way. And you'll see when we get to the next few slides, we're going to talk about once you get them to think in this way, then you're able to create, to have them create games where they not only demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of the system, but master it on a much deeper level. Because as we all know, there's tons of research that shows when you have to articulate and communicate things to other people, when you have to build something, when you have to make it, when you do something hands-on, that it becomes much deeper comprehension, much deeper retention. Add the benefit of creativity and play, and you've got a recipe for gold there.
Jordan, give us some examples of some of these other playing systems. I love that we started with one that people are so familiar with, the classic card games, and then the spin-offs that we have with kids where they decide what's in or out and sort with their patterns. And you've got solitaire there as one we're familiar with. Go through the rest of the pieces here, and if you can explain how there's a springboard from a well-known game and how you can have students take that system into their own creation.
Yeah, certainly. So let's look at these playing systems. So yeah, I've already talked about the sorting sequence and pattern recognition, which is solitaire. But I'll briefly say it again. Just think about when you're playing solitaire, you're constantly going through a pattern recognition, counting process, and building these multiple stacks of meaningful. Stacks, columns, rows of meaningful sequence things. If you think of a game, this game of we listed it as chance here for Chutes and Ladders, which is certainly true. because all you do is roll a die and you don't know what number you're getting. But at the same time, it's a system of counting. As I said, it's about simply counting to 100, and sometimes you have to go back, right, and start over. I mean, it's just kind of who gets there first. But in the process, you're starting to learn how to think about that kind of progression. There's games about accumulation and trade and exchange, and I've mentioned it briefly. Monopoly is that, and this becomes games that are really just about how do you collect the most of something. Of course, they get complicated trade rules in there, and those systems become really powerful. A great number of our games are actually about that kind of trade and exchange. But also when it's not just, it doesn't have to be Monopoly, which is this sort of clear monetary model, right? Even a game like Trivial Pursuit, to some extent, is about the accumulation of knowledge and ideas, and you essentially have to fill your pie with knowledge as you move along the board, and you get these multiple opportunities to do it. It doesn't have to trade and exchange, but it still has that accumulation element. Scavenger hunts and puzzle games. I only say that people are probably going, wait, how is a scavenger hunt a puzzle game? Because essentially what we do is we give all these hints to how to get to the pieces to fill in the final puzzle, right? So we give hints and you have to solve that puzzle. There's also puzzler games that are just puzzles, but I don't know that we have to get into them in so much detail. Movement games like charades and Twister. I love these kinds of games because I think we often forget to involve the body in a lot of what we do, and especially we think of games as sort of being about being puzzlers and mind bending and intellectual things. So this idea that you could build. That you could build these movement games like charades and twisters, but it doesn't have to be Twister, because Twister is still to some extent a sorting game. You have to find the different colors and do things in different colors, but it's a sorting game that involves the whole body. You could imagine how you could replace any of those colors on the Twister board with anything. Right? Like you have to you can put your foot on amoebas, right? Put your left arm on zebras, right? It could be anything and whatever you want to kind of get into this embodied sense. Strategy games like chess and Settlers of Catan. These are fantastic games that have really complex rule sets of many different ways that people can move. My kids were able to play chess at a very young age, and they wanted to play chess at a very young age. It gets to this sense of how easy it is for kids to comprehend a complex system when they're playing. Settlers of Catan, it's a little more complicated than a game like chess, but it's not. But still, kids can learn it at a very young age when they're playing. But what if, and this is why it says what if on that bullet point, what if we could build games like this that were about the topics we needed to cover in our curriculum, right? And what if, even better, we could get the students to build the games like this? Because my guess is the students are going to be even more creative than the teachers at thinking of great games that they can build to demonstrate the knowledge, not just to demonstrate it, but really to understand it. And I'll show you in a few slides what happened when I asked my kids with very little guidance how to create games that would teach other kids the things they were learning in school at the moment. And we'll show that in a few slides.
I love that. I love the what if, because if we leave it up to kids to take these principles, I think what we're showing here is game systems we're familiar with, but we don't want to be bound by that or locked by it. It's really to help us understand as adults what we're talking about here as a framework. But this what if of taking something that kids are familiar with and letting them run. And I'm noticing the text box, someone added a really wise comment that she's found if students can play the game, they can take that system into their own direction. And that really is the what if that we're talking about. So I love that comment in the text box. Let's then move to the different kinds of games that we've seen kids make, right? And one of my favorite here is you go through these. Well, there are a couple here. It's, we're most familiar with the card games and the board games. Those are, classic and traditional. I love, Jordan, that you're talking about movement games and whole room games and whole school games. And please remember to tell us about the wonderful story about the Underground Railroad game that you still remember from your childhood. It was so impactful that memory stays clear for you. And then I think we've got a really important conversation about games that build collaborative skills instead of competitive, and that there's this sense of we all win, or the person who helps the most is the one who wins. So great for us to talk about those. So dive into these game systems.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is now we're going to talk about what happens when students make the game. So I tried now before in all the previous slides to talk about the way game systems can represent much more complex knowledge. And it's just, one of the reasons I did that was we often tend to think of games and play as something superficial, as something sort of frivolous. And so now so I presented all those slides to kind of say, think about all the underlying understanding, comprehension, retention, ideas, concepts that underlie any average game and the kinds of games you could imagine yourself. Now we're going to take it a step deeper and go, what if the kids make the games? And so my kids, in this case, not only made games, but they also made slides. And so here they have a slide, which I think is a hammer and an anvil. Not entirely sure what it was, but that's what they thought when I said making. But the reason I wanted to start with this slide about game making is not just to be a title slide and say, hey, we're going into game making. I wanted to make sure you think about this idea of hands-on experiential learning, right? Maker spaces are so big right now. Creativity is so important. The idea that kids could be building their own thing, using their own creative ideas, I wanted to make sure that I expressed that here in a slide. The first thing I did with my kids was I said, hey, we want to build a card game. So I turned this game to my 9-year-old. I said, hey 9-year-old, what I want you to do is tell me how you would build a card game that would demonstrate what you're learning at school. And the first thing I said was, well, what are you learning at school? And he told me he was working on understanding the differences between species and genus, and thinking about the animal kingdom, thinking about the habitat of animals, thinking about where they live, what they eat, whether they're herbivores or omnivores or carnivores. And so he told me he wanted to build a game, and he was going to build a card game like that. And the card game that he ended up building was going to be a game that was going to involve a couple different categories. And you can see here what he did. He picked up his computer, he picked up a clipboard, he picked up some paper, and the first thing he did was drew out the different categories that he was going to use in his card game. He said, I'm going to have to do some research. So he gets on the internet and he starts to think about, well, what are the animals? And no, he didn't quite do it in order from left to right. So you want to start by looking at that third column there, species, and you'll see he decided he was going to have a hippo card and a dolphin card and an eagle card and a narwhal card and a polar bear card and a camel card and a monkey card. And then he looked them up and said, well, what are they? Are they mammals? Are they amphibious? And he looked up, what do they eat? Are they herbivores? Are they carnivores? Are they omnivores? And then he looked at their habitat, and you can see over there all the way on the left there, this question that he looked up is, do they live in the sky? Do they live in the ocean? Do they live in the Arctic? Do they live in the desert? He looks up all of this stuff on the internet, just simple research. But you can see what's huge here is that he's doing the research. In fact, he's already learned a ton. If he builds no game after this, he's already done the kind of work we would really like to see many students doing from an intrinsically motivated place. He's not doing this because I'm telling him to study for a test. This is a Sunday morning, and he's sitting there going, "This is going to be fun." After that, he took the knowledge that he had and he started to design the cards. So here he is starting to draw, right? And in doing this, he needs to start to be creative, and he needs to start to solve problems about how much can he fit on each card. You can see on the computer screen there, he's looking up what the hippo looks like. To draw the hippo card. And I remember having this whole discussion with him where he realized he didn't have space on a card to draw a perfect hippo. So what did he have to use of the hippo's shape of its body to be able to represent hippo, right? Because part of when you're building a card game is not only that you're learning about what species or what habitat animals belong to. You also have to figure out how you're going to create a symbolic system that works on the cards, right? So he's starting to do this, and he's starting to transfer those categories from his clipboard through a symbolic system onto cards that are going to make sense. After that, he finishes the cards, and he's built them. So you can see here some of the cards that he's starting to play, but he can't play alone. So he has to now show me, and he has to show his older brother how the system works to get us to play. So he's laying it out for us, and he's going, there's an eagle, there's a hippo, and what you have to do is you get 2 points if you match up the plant, their habitat with the species, and then you can attack. They have attack points, but omnivores can't attack as strong as carnivores, and herbivores. I mean, I don't remember the system because it was so complex, but it involved a lot of really deep thinking about the subjects that he was learning. And I just wanted to show this slide, which just kind of shows you all of the cards he made, the cards for the animals and the cards for the habitats. And the goal became to sort the animals into the right habitats, right? So this you can think about how the mechanics of a game like this are about more than just retention, right? They really are starting to think about, how do I make them behave? How do the rules of the game mimic the kind of learning and the subject matter and the content and the context that we want that he wants to demonstrate. After this, I turned to my older son, my 12-year-old, and I asked him to build a board game. And I started by saying, hey, what are you learning in school? And he told me, we're learning about how elections work in social studies. We're learning about how the presidential election system works. And I said, okay, so how would you build a game about that? He said, well, I'm going to build a game, and the game that I'm going to build is going to involve a board game where what you have to do is it becomes a race to the White House. And what he built was a game actually very simple, similar to Chutes and Ladders in some ways, where you roll dice, and depending on how you roll, you get to move forward different things. But what you can see is he's got the iPad open next to him, and he's starting, to research the symbolic system. So he's researching what symbol system is he going to use to represent the different things on the different, because these are small squares. You can't write a full sentence onto a square. You can't write a full word. He's got to figure out how he's going to do that in a symbolic system. So these become really strong rhetorical skills, really strong symbolic thinking skills. So what he eventually builds is a whole game where each square means something different. So in each of these squares, he may do something like, hey, you had a scandal, go back 3 squares. You won the debate, go forward 5 squares. You got a major newspaper endorsement, go 3 squares. It's still just a game of chance, right? We're not trying to teach people how to win the election. But we are, when we're trying to teach people how to understand a political system, how to understand governance, to think about the order of events and to think about how they work in order. And that's precisely what he did. After that, he had the same problem as the other one. He had to teach his brother how to play, and you can see how he's built nice little characters of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and he even built the dice out of Model Magic there. And he's starting to teach how to play. He's explaining what all the squares mean. Again, this idea of symbolic thinking for a second. You can't write in a square, you lost a debate, go back 3 squares. So he has to figure out how to write that in 4 words. He's got to figure out how to write that in a simple system. And I'll just show you here what he ends up building in the end. So you can see there's the beginning of the primary, there's the announcement of the candidacy. Even if you look at the end, right before the White House, you have to win the popular vote, you have to win the electoral vote. Sure, it's just a dice move, but he's had to learn all of these steps. He's had to communicate them. He's had to articulate them. He's had to use his artistic skills. I love his little picture of the White House at the end. I love the little figures he built. All of this becomes a super, super deep engagement with this concept, and with all of the knowledge he needs to understand about how the system works. And he was really, really invested in this. These become 2 other examples. Now, I didn't get examples to tell him how to build whole body games, but you can start to imagine how you might build a whole body game, how you might be able to, kids, if you can get them to think in the same way about how you build a system, you could build a whole body game where the kids themselves become the avatars, right? So you hop around the square, right? I often think of whole body games very much as like when you play life-size chess and a life-size chessboard. If you could build a game about Race to the White House in a school classroom where you just make each tile on the floor a different game, a different step on the way to it. It becomes fantastic. You can also make a more complex whole body game where you have to pretend certain things, where you have to act out kinds of things. We didn't get to do this because I had already exhausted them by the end of Sunday morning in just building those two games. You can imagine how my kids had to do that in a few hours, but that could be an entire, building those board games and those card games, that could be an entire week's curriculum. Because it takes 30 minutes to do the research, to 50 or an hour to do the research, and an hour to draw the pieces, and an hour, and it combines all this multidisciplinary learning. The other thing I want to talk about besides whole body games and board games is whole school games, and I love this idea of whole school games. I love games that connect. Where I often think whole school games could be, each classroom could be a piece, or each classroom could be a place on the way. But I love the idea, and this is where we get into, Sherry, what we were saying a second ago, what you were saying about the difference between collaborative and competitive games. Most of the time when I hear about schools doing full school games, they make these sort of accumulation games that are about steep competition between classrooms. You know, like you'll win a pizza party if you do the best at something else. I'd love to see whole school games that are all about collaboration, where you win by making the most collaborative deals with multi-classrooms, right? So the classroom that's able to make the most exchanges with the most other classrooms wins, right? Because that's a game where the underlying mechanics become about collaboration and encourage collaboration. They may still be competitive, and you may still win, but you win by cooperating. You win by collaborating. That's what I would like to see. I love these. I love that idea. It drives me crazy whenever my kids do that. And then you asked me to talk about my own childhood example of a whole school game that was not competitive at all. It was only collaborative. I went to a school in Philadelphia, and I will never forget this. We would do a whole school game where we would learn about the Underground Railroad. And for those international people on this webinar, the Underground Railroad is this idea. It is how they smuggled African Americans out of slavery right when slavery was ending in the U.S. And what we all had to do is all of the students became the slaves, and we had to escape by moving classroom to classroom. In the dark, actually, even, right? And we talk about it when I see old friends from school. We talk about it all the time because it was this crazy thing where we would show up in one classroom and someone would be playing the mean slave owner, and we might have to hide for a while because he was walking around in the hallway. This became this deep experiential understanding where we had to work together, make deals, trade, figure out how to navigate through a half scavenger hunt, half role-playing game to be able to get to the end where we would get our freedom. It was a full-day game. It took all day long. It was a ton of fun, full of physical exercise, full class exercise. Each person played a different role, and it's something we all remembered forever and gave us this sense of understanding. That's a great example of a non-competitive game because actually the goal was for everyone to get to freedom. So that's all my examples. I just wanted to give you this quick and of course I'm sure you'll have some questions for me, Sherry, that I'll be happy to answer. But I just want to make sure I do take the time here to just say to just point out some of the terms and the ideas that I've used here are like directly lifted from people like Katie Salen and James Paul G, and the great work they do at the Institute of Play and the Quest to Learn School in New York City, which is a high school that's designed around video game design. They have about the same amount of technology as every other class, but they do exactly the kinds of things that we're talking about here. We're thinking about the deep game mechanics. They teach everything using that concept and that notion of systems thinking. And if you need to understand any event, any subject, anything at all. You can understand it as a game with rules and a magic circle and mechanics and elements and tokens and things like things like that. Oh, sorry.
We've received quite a few questions, and I'm glad you brought up an example of a high school, because when we do go to the Q&A, we had people who've asked for some examples that you recommend for high schools. So great. But before we do that, we'd like to transition. Welcome back, Kristen. We'd love for you to share your insight on a cross-curricular learning games that you've made with your children.
Absolutely. So this is a game that I made with my students when I was teaching. We did it at the end of the school year, and we wanted to really pull in multiple subjects together. And you can see these are board games that they made, completely student-led. And these were games that we took games that we bought at a thrift store and repurposed them. You could make absolutely original games, but it's just another idea. You can see we had lots of standards here, and I did teach in North Carolina, so we were bringing in North Carolina economics, which is where you see that social studies standards, and really trying to find a way to hit home how capital and natural resources affect a region of the state and how those have an effect on the imports and the exports and the arts community, and all types of trickle I guess, effects throughout the community and the regions. We brought in those writing standards, the ones you can see there, but also what was brought in were the speaking and the listening standards. Students had to pose and they had to answer questions. They had to write descriptions. They had to make advertisements for their games. They had to write the questions. There's nonfiction reading. They were so enamored about learning more about the state, and really economics is sort of a hard thing to teach younger students. And I did this with fourth graders. But then the research that they did on their own was so highly inquiry based that it was hard to pull them away from the reading that they were doing to come up with strategies to make their games more complex. And then the math, we started with just a few math standards, but we realized that we were hitting more because the students were making the games so much more complex. And it really became a great way to differentiate within the classroom, depending on the student groups that we had there. And then, of course, those national art standards we brought in, the creating the games that the students actually did. But then each game had to have a creating component in it as they were playing. They presented their games. They played each other's games. We did this one with an entire grade level in groups. So then the groups were playing each other's games and offering feedback on how, and I see that question about assessing the creation of games, how they would assess each other's games. We had a rubric that we used before we started this unit, but they were assessing themselves as well as others there. And you can see this game is actually on our website. It's called Economics in Action. It would be adaptable to any state, but we were chosen to use this game at the first White House Arts Integration Fair. And you can see my students there with some of the games that they created, and they were presenting those and playing those games with others. And then really the thing that was just so important was that it was challenging, that the students, it wasn't that they just memorized facts when we were assessing them on these different subjects that they were learning and then giving those facts back to us. They really needed to know the subject matter to create those games and then to play those games, to analyze their own directions, to figure out what was right and what was wrong with their game. And then it had to be relevant, this application of the concepts. They were really, in order to win, they needed to know the information from the different subjects and how those subjects interacted together. So it wasn't just silos of information that the students were doing. But then they really came across how to strategize. How do you get better at playing a game? How can you change the instructions of a game? What makes for more effective directions and what makes for more effective gameplay? So that was just a fantastic benefit of this whole unit that we did. And you can see here on Crayola.com/lesson plans is the way to find these student-led game making and learning. And you'll see that we have other games there that are available. And we really invite you to we're launching this Crayola Creativity Champion community where we really invite you to join us so you can connect with other creativity champions. It's an online community of art advocates. And you can see how to sign up there at the bottom of that slide, Crayola.com/champions. You can find all of the information there that you need. But just really, if you're looking for ways to build creative capacity and leadership school-wide, we encourage you to visit our site. There are fantastic resources there. And then Sherry, do you want to take this slide?
Sure. So, we always close our sessions by asking you to make a note to yourself and plan your next steps. So either add it in the text box so we can see what you're thinking, or make a private note to yourself on a notepad. What ideas really stuck with you that you've heard today, and do you plan on using in your school or your learning community? And get specific. Which of the ideas will you use, and when will your students start to create these games? And with colleagues and with parents, how are you going to articulate the value of the student-led game making? You've now been hearing about the benefits as well as how to introduce the mechanics and the systems, and you've seen a lot of examples of very effective student-led games. So because we're really passionate about seeing your examples, we like to offer this as an incentive. It helps to bring in some of those photos. And so for those first 50 educators who post photos of student-made learning games, we will send you a class pack of Corello Model Magic. It's one of our most popular products. It ties in really well to game making. You saw in the examples of Jordan's 11-year-old son how he used those the Model Magic to make dice, to make characters. It could be really fun and add a three-dimensional piece to your games. So we'd love for you to participate in that. And I think now we're going to do some questions, right? Yeah, questions and answers. So we got a couple that Diane sent to us, and please continue to send some in on the text. The first, Jordan, you had mentioned a high school in New York that does a lot with game making, and one of the questions came from someone who works with high-functioning high schoolers who are on the autism spectrum, and said, what kinds of games would you suggest? And I know that's a little bit hard for you to know without knowing her kids, but I'm sure you've got experience in how to introduce game making at the wide age ranges.
Yeah. I mean, actually, what I would say is game making is fairly easy to do at almost any age range, and I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily familiar with the autism spectrums. I mean, I'm familiar with it, but not in any sort of expert about it. But my sense is that you can really introduce almost any kind of game at any age level. It's the content of the game and that symbolic system that you place on top of that. In top of it, that I think is limited by age and the complexity, right? You may not be able to teach complex economic concepts through games to little tiny kindergarten kids, but that doesn't mean they can't play that complex economics game that you were just talking about. They certainly will learn very quickly the rules of the game and how to play it. They might not be able to do what we call transfer, which is that transfer out of the game into understanding it in a larger real life. I think that's what gets limited at an age range, is the transfer of understanding it within a wider context, not the concept of the game mechanics themselves. That's why I start with that slide that games make complex systems impossibly simple. There's actually a video game called Dragon Box that teaches how to solve algebra equations that my kids started using when they were 4. And by the time they were done, they could solve complex algebraic equations on a touch screen because it was taught through a game. Now, they couldn't tell it when I put it on paper for them at 4, but they could do it within the rules of the game fine, which means at the point when they got to the age where they could do it on paper, it was much more familiar. They don't understand that they're sliding around numbers. They think they're sliding around pictures. But once you teach them those things, there gets to be an age where they can do that transfer. So I wouldn't worry so much about the age level of the game. Just worry about the age level of the content. Games. I'm almost 40 years old, and I still enjoy playing most games with my kids. The games are ageless to some extent. But the content of the game is certainly has to be age specific. I'd also say my experience is kids are usually ready for things much younger than we tend to think. There's certainly some ideas I don't think my kids should have to deal with yet, but that doesn't mean they're not capable of it.
So your answer to that ties in well to one of the and that's one of the participants was looking for a recommendation on game playing systems that she should use with children who have special needs. Now, again, it's probably difficult for you to answer without a broad perspective here because individual special needs really vary across the board. But what game systems might you start with? Have you found some game systems are an easier access ramp for kids to start making?
Yeah, so again, this is sort of a complicated question because I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to pretend that I can really speak to what works with special needs. But from those people that I have spoken to about it, I would say that I've heard more often than not that creating whole body games are best for kids with special needs. But again, I'm not an expert, so I can't say that with any sort of definitive. I'm just kind of sharing what I feel like the sense is I've heard from others at this point, and I don't want to pretend to be an expert on something I'm not. But I would say often what I hear about with special needs kids is that there's usually some issue of their ability to deal with the language. The symbolic system. So the more that you can put that symbolic system in an embodied way, the better that it sits deeper. So I would think about really building whole body games. I mean, I'm an advocate for that all the way across special needs and non-special needs kids, but certainly it's an answer to the question. I'd encourage everyone to do it all the time, whole body everything, because when kids get things in their body, things are different.
Kristen, thank you for chiming in with the text. You added the kinesthetic. So that, again, is a very tactile experience, getting the hands and the senses.
Absolutely. Moving. And working with ESL children, ESL populations, because, kids are having to communicate within these games. And the more they're able to speak with each other, they're building those communication skills, whether it doesn't really matter their population, but the more they can communicate and express themselves, I think the better off they are.
Great. And another question, I think we probably have time for just one more question. Jordan, if you could discuss, there have been some questions about teachers wondering when they should, if they should join in students' gameplay. So if you could address sort of the pros and cons of the teacher joining in game play, so that might help people sort out when is the most appropriate time to step in and when it's a good time to step out and let children own it themselves.
Yeah, so just like with I think everything in teaching, it's sort of a difficult balance question here, because our job as teachers is always to facilitate and guide. I like to think when I'm teaching in a college classroom, which is where I do my teaching, I like to think of myself more as a Sherpa than anything else, right? Like my job is simply to lead, to show them the path, right, and then let them walk it and go through the obstacles themselves. But often showing them the path means a lot more detailed help than you'd like to think. When I was building those games with my kids, I presented as if they just did it all themselves. But certainly I sat there and said, well, don't you think maybe you should look on the internet and think about what are all the steps to the White House? And then I stepped back. And with the card game, I certainly said, well, wait a second. I don't understand. Are you going to have different cards for animals and for habitats, or are you going to put that on the card? Or it always becomes this sort of questioning in the creative process to encourage the movement without necessarily pushing in the right direction. I tell my students all the time, my expertise, I have a PhD, but I always tell them they're actually the experts. The only thing I'm an expert in once I have a PhD is asking questions. That's it. I'm really, really good at asking questions. And so all I do is ask them more and more questions and help teach them the questions they may not have thought to ask. But it's on them to find the answer. So that's my answer to the first part of that question, which is in the game creation process, how much do teachers engage? In terms of the playing process, well, you have to engage 100% when the game is built and they go, let's play, because that's the point where you say, I'm going to acknowledge, I'm going to validate, and I'm going to participate in your way of understanding this material, and I'm going to see it through your eyes. And that's the point that we miss so often, because we think of we so often teach in ways that are about teaching kids to see things through our eyes. No, what we want to do is teach them to see it through their eyes and to show them how what they see through their eyes is valuable, meaningful, and that if they can articulate that back in a way that's useful to everyone, then it's also powerful.
That's beautiful. Wow, what a great ending. I know we have a couple of wrap-up slides to explain a bit more, but that is such a high point to end on. The fact that the best we have is to ask questions and show them the path, and then to honor their work by playing the game they work so hard to create, and step in there and see it with that lens. So beautiful. I know, Kristen, you've got some wrap-up slides here to talk about the certificate.
Yes. So if you logged in live with your email address, and we just had a question about this, so it's a great timing. Your certificate will be emailed to you the next business day. So if you watch the webinar live, you don't need to do anything else except for look for the email. If you join live by phone, you do need to take the CE quiz. And if you're watching the recording, you do need to take the quiz to get that certificate. And to take the quiz, you just join the community. It's www.edweb.net/creativity, and you'll find the quiz in the webinar archives. And we'd like to thank you for joining us today. This is the last webinar of 2016, and we look forward to seeing you in 2017. So if you are part of the community, you will get a notice. And for an invitation, make sure you join the next webinar. And you'll see the information at the bottom of the screen. And again, if you join the Champion Creativity community, you'll get a notification about the next webinar that's coming. And the community is completely free. We do invite you to join that, and you'll receive invitations to upcoming webinars. Webinar recordings and resources are there in the archives. You can take the quizzes, and you can see lots of online discussions. And again, the link to the community is at the bottom of that screen, edweb.net/creativity. And again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for Sherry and for Jordan for being part of this webinar and sharing your knowledge with us. And I hope that all of you who are out there really try some game making with your students in the next few days and weeks.
Great.
I think that's it.
I really appreciate we have 105 people in the room. It's
absolutely still.
Yep. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jordan. We appreciate you came back that second time. So, you know, we did this a few weeks ago and it wasn't recorded, so we appreciate your coming back, and we've now got it, on film, in the can, so to speak, and ready for people to log on. So thank you very much. And we're seeing people say goodbye and that they're really appreciating and planning on using these.